Hey everybody, welcome back to my series on learning Maya for beginners. This is going to be our first look at texturing and adding color or textures to these objects. We haven't spent too much time talking about rendering. We've talked about modeling. We need to kind of briefly introduce rendering today. So I want to open up my render settings, which is this clapboard with a gear icon, because what you can do here is first make sure that you're using a renderer that you want to be using. So in Maya 2020, the default is Arnold. This used to be Mental Ray, and someday in the future it might change again on us. It's kind of whoever Autodesk has business deals with to get the renderer. So in this comment tab, I'm going to scroll all the way down to image size. This is the first thing we need to check. For the presets, we've got a lot of good options for the size that we can work with. 1080 is going to be our high quality setting, our HD setting. Most of the time, if you're doing animations, you'll probably output into this. If it's just going to be for a demo reel or something, 720 will be fine. I'm just going to go with the 720 and hit close. So when we do a render, you'll see that by default, it's just going to show up, if mine even renders at all here, there we go. It's just going to show up black. That's because we don't have any lights in the scene. So in the next video, I'm going to introduce all the different lights that we can use. For today, I'm just going to go with this Arnold Light Physical Sky. What this does for us is it creates this giant sphere around our scene, and this has sort of an imitation of a sky in it. And now you'll see if I zoom back in here, do another render. I've got this perpetual spinning blue gear here, so we'll see if my Maya survives today. But you'll see that now we're starting to get a render. We're getting some shadows. The light from the sky is going to hit these and, bounce off and hit other surfaces. So we'll talk more about lighting, but in order to see what we're actually texturing and adding shaders and whatever, we want to make sure that we can actually see the results. The next thing I like to do is turn on my resolution gate. That's this button right here. What this allows me to see is what the actual aspect ratio, what the actual framing composition of my render is going to be, because this window changes. If I've got my channel box open or closed, for example, this window is it's very different. The aspect ratio has changed when we make those alterations. So the first place I want to check for texturing is my Hypershade window. There are several different workflows for doing this, so I'm going to kind of show you a couple here. So once I open this up, you'll see I've got the materials window over here. This will keep a list of all of the different materials that I've created. I've got the list of available shaders or nodes here that I can use, and this will change based on whatever I have selected over here. This is my node editor, which we're going to take a look at a little bit later. You'll see stuff appear in here today, but I won't spend too much time talking about it. We've got a shader ball over here. Mine is not showing up correctly at this moment. I wonder if I change this, if it's just going to crash everything. But normally this is going to show you essentially what your textures are looking like. Oh, and probably because I've got my AI Physical Sky selected is why this is not showing up the way I am intending. So I'm going to select one of these just to get my Lambert one selected, or I could just select the Lambert one here. And you'll see now I've got, in this case I chose Teapot, shader ball is the default. This is essentially just a way to show you, give you an idea of what your textures or shaders are looking like. You'll see you also have some options for different color temperatures. So if I switch to this one, it's much cooler. You've got some outside ones. So usually you'll pick whatever is going to look most similar to your scene. And then this is the property editor, or essentially the same as the attribute editor, which is going to let you control all the different settings. Now this Lambert 1, this is the default gray that goes onto everything. So you don't want to change this up if you're trying to create a new texture. You want to create a new shader over here. So I'm going to go to the Arnold tab, Shaders, and we're going to do everything with the aiStandardSurface. Now, this workflow is going to be different if you're using a different render engine. Back when we used Mental Ray, we used the MIA Material X or whatever it was called as kind of the most default shader. And if you're using, RenderMan or V-Ray or whatever render engine, you might be doing kind of a different workflow. But most of them will have this default shader that sort of has all of your main settings to get realistic materials. So you'll see that this one starts out, unlike the Lambert, where it's a very matte, flat color, this one starts out with a specular highlight on this. And if we start looking at these settings, we'll see we have base, specular, transmission, subsurface, coat, sheen, emission, etc. So we're going to kind of look at the main ones today. I'm going to start with this base, and I'm going to bring the base weight up to 1. If I drop my specularity all the way down, you'll see that this is going to be more similar to what we had seen in the Lambert color, where we have this matte kind of flat color without those shiny reflections, those specular highlights. So in the weight, I can take color, double click into here, and I can change the color. So maybe I'll just switch this one to a reddish color here. You've got roughness, and then you've got metalness. For now, I'm going to ignore those, and I'm just going to get a completely matte color onto my first sphere that I've created. So I moved my window over. There's a couple ways that you can apply these textures. The first method, if you find the texture over here, which, by the way, we should always be giving a name, so I'm just going to call this one matte color. Always good to name things. If we use our middle mouse scroll wheel as a button, and we click and drag this onto a surface, that's one way of adding that shader to the surface. So I'm going to create a new aiStandardSurface now. Let's call this one Specular Color. We don't need to change much on this one because we can give this a base weight. Go with a different color here. And a base color. And you'll see that we still have those specular highlights. But I want to talk a little bit about what those actually will do. We have a weight for the specularity, so we can decrease this, and you'll see that the amount of that shine is going to change. We have a color of the specularity, so sometimes you want that specularity to reflect in kind of this white way. Maybe you wanted to add a lighter green, so it's reflecting more similar to the color that you've created. This is going to be changing kind of according to what you are going to need for a specific material. The roughness setting, I might actually go just back to white just so you can see roughness a little clearer. Roughness is going to change how sharp these reflections are within the materials. Right now they're very sharp. This is like a very polished, glassy, glossy, almost, wet looking specular highlight. If I increase this roughness, you'll see that this starts dispersing a little bit more evenly over the object, and we get a much different result. So this is the first thing that I tend to play around with when I'm kind of working with specularity. And you'll see that if I bump this all the way up, I get a similar material as if I had just taken the specularity out completely, where it's looking a lot more matte. The next thing is this index refraction. Index of refraction is how the light is refracted into or off of this object. You'll notice that they've given us, if I click on this kind of option menu here, some different default surfaces. So we've got glass, ice, plastic, and clicking those is going to change this value slightly. Now, this is really going to come into play, especially when we start looking at transmission, which is our transparency. But it's always good to try to get this based on whatever material you're trying to create. And a lot of times, I'm just on Google looking up index of refraction for very specific materials that I'm trying to create. Okay, your anisotropy and your rotation are going to affect how these specular highlights are kind of being interacted with on the object. And they're changing kind of subtly here and there. These settings are very specific to kind of the object and the material that you're making. I usually give the example of something like a marble, and how, if we have a sphere, instead of getting a more circular highlight, it might kind of be that almost S curve. If you've looked at kind of, that marble reflection that you might get. So this is one where you're really going to have to play around with these based on specific materials that might use them, and may not find yourself using these as frequently for just kind of some basic materials. So I'm going to apply this one now to my object, and I'm going to do this in a different way. For this one, I'm going to select the object first, hold right click, go down to assign existing material, and then over to specular color. So this is going to show any of the materials I have created, and then you can assign it that way. Now, another workflow that people will use is they'll go to assign new material, and then this menu will pop up. So I can go to the shaders, I can create an aiStandardSurface, and then I can click on the aiStandardSurface in my attribute editor, and I can just work in this window. So I don't even need to open up the hypershade. I can create everything right here in front of me. And a lot of artists do like to use this workflow as well. For the purposes of just showing this shader ball so you can immediately see some results, I'm gonna continue this from here. So we'll call this one let's go with a metal color. So for this one, I'm going to increase my base weight, choose a color. I'm going to go with kind of a yellowish, just so I can do maybe sort of a gold color. Something about like that's fine. You'll see that in our base, we have this metalness slider that we kind of ignored a second ago. If I bump this up all the way to 1, this is turning this material into kind of a pure metal, is the way that I think of this. So right now, this is like ultra chrome, ultra shiny, ultra polished. So sometimes I'll see people kind of playing around with this and just going less with the metal slider, so it's not as extreme. I tend to just bump it all the way to 1 if I'm working with metal, and instead work with this roughness slider. So if I start bumping this up, you'll see that I start getting a little bit more of this almost textured, kind of brushed aluminum type feel to a surface, and it's less chrome. So if I were to create an actual gold, I'm trying to figure out just how reflective this is versus how much this light is going to scatter over this object using this kind of roughness setting. So there's kind of a gold color, we'll call that good. And you'll see this is assigned. Any changes I make to this are going to automatically change our shader over here. And in our viewport, if you use full metal, it just goes black. That's just kind of how this viewport looks at these materials. Remember, this is just a preview of what things look like, and it's not going to give us the most accurate result until we actually do a render. Okay, I'm going to do one more aiStandardSurface, and this one we're going to call glass color. Now, your naming conventions are going to be very different based on who you're working for. That's just what I'm going for today. So I'm going to open up transmission, and you'll see here, if I start increasing this weight, this object is slowly going to get more and more transparent. So right now it's a little bit translucent, of course. We don't see perfectly through this. If I go all the way to 1, I'm now getting a full transparent, almost glass-like object. And you'll see here that my weight has completely grayed out. That's because this does not matter, does not apply. Any of these base colors don't exist if this is pure glass. Now, in my specularity, I'm still going to look at this index of refraction. And if I want to use glass, this is really going to change what this object looks like if it's transparent, because that's where you often see a lot of this refraction the most, is when light is passing through an object. And the elementary school version of this is if you have that clear glass cup of water and you put a pencil into it, the pencil will kind of shift and change size based on how you're looking through it. That's what refraction is ultimately doing. So now you'll see I have a color option under transmission as well. So we could give this kind of a tinted glass effect. If I was going to make, one of those green tinted glass objects, I'll hit done here. And you've got things like depth and scatter, scatter the anisotropy. All of these things you can play around with to see what it's going to do to the object. I'm going to go ahead and assign this one as is, just so we can move right along. But there's one thing that we have to talk about. With the Arnold Renderer in particular, I don't know that all renderers do this. Mental Ray, I don't recall you had to do anything like this. But if you have any degree of transparency on an object, you have to change one of the settings in the actual object itself rather than in the material. And if I go to the Arnold tab with the object selected, we have this little opaque option. So opaque meaning that light would not pass through this, whereas unchecking this would suggest that there's some degree of transparency, so light can pass through this. Let's see if we can notice it in the render. It's going to depend on what our shadow is actually doing. But I'm going to just run a render here, and this is good to kind of see what all of our materials are actually looking like. And where gold is, you'll see that this one's got some specularity. We can see the sun reflecting through here. Okay, yeah, and we are going to notice this. So the shadow in particular, if we see this, it's casting a similar shadow to all of these other objects, where it's just a solid shadow, and we're getting kind of some weird artifacts from this shadow, and it doesn't look as transparent as it should. I'm going to save this here. This button just kind of saves a version that you can compare. I'm going to uncheck this. Let's run another render. Now, rendering is a slow process, especially once you're trying to add more details in here. When it's harder for this to actually render, it's just going to take a lot of time. I was looking up Toy Story 3, and some of those frames could take 39 hours to render. So now that I've unchecked opaque, you'll see that I'm getting a green cast light. This is called a caustic effect, where the light is penetrating our surface, and because this is a green glass, it's going to cast this green light onto the ground, this greenish kind of shadow. So if I compare, if you're just looking at this sphere, when we kind of flip between these two versions, you'll see even how it's reflecting over in the gold. It is very different based on whether we uncheck or check this opaque. So any kind of transparent object, make sure you don't forget that, because I see a lot of students in particular forgetting that setting, and sometimes it will look kind of right, but not quite what you actually want. So this is our basic intro into shaders and into using the aiStandardSurface. One thing that I do want to quickly point out, if I were to create a new aiStandardSurface here, Arnold does give us some presets. So if I click into these presets and I look at all these different options, brushed metal, car paint, bubble, you can go over to replace, or you can blend compared to whatever you have currently. But if I hit replace, it will just change all of the settings based on what it thinks are the properties of, in this case, a bubble. So in this case, it's actually using the thin film in order to get a thickness and IOR to create this. You'll see changing this, I get some pretty odd results. I always tell students that they're welcome to use these presets, but I don't want them to use them as if this is like concrete fact, as if I go to the preset for gold, this is perfect gold no matter what. And that actually did not change all of my settings. My thin film did not reset, so this is not going to look like gold at all. But I have a lot of students who just use these like, oh well, if this is if it says frosted glass is going to be this, I'm going to use it. If this is what it says honey is, then I'm going to use it. Use this as a starting point, but you always want to change the settings according to your specific project, to what looks best in your project. And sometimes these settings will get it exactly right, but other times you will want to make tweaks to get the material looking correct within your specific project. Okay, so this is the Hypershade. We did some quick rendering, added aiStandardSurface as a shader to these different spheres, changed some of the settings. So we got an introduction on how you can create a matte, specular, metallic, and transparent object. We will continue with some lighting from here. But that's all I wanted to go over today, so I will see you next time.